Hey, I'm Mike. Welcome to my wood shop. So I wanted to build a narrow workbench to go against one of the walls in my shop. Now this workbench isn't like a lot of the other builds on YouTube. Really, this is just going to be a good sturdy work surface. Now, I wanted it to be like a cabinet maker's bench in that it would be nice and flat and sturdy and I could hammer and chop on it, but I just didn't want to have all the hardware. In the future I may add some dog holes or a planing stopper of ice or something, but for now it's just going to be a work surface. And I got started in the usual way of using the chop saw, the bandsaw, the joiner, and planer to rough out some parts. So the dimensions of all the parts were really determined by the board that I had. I had a 8/4, 10-foot long, 8.5-inch wide ash board. Actually, I had two of those. So I decided all the parts were going to be about 4 inches wide. And for the thickness, I was just going to plane them as little as possible to get them 4 squared. And the length of each of the parts pretty much laid themselves out based on the top that I had glued up, which you can see on the left side of this picture. And the top is made out of something called LVL, which stands for laminated veneer lumber. And those are typically beams used in framing. Here you get a better shot of the top. I'm using it as sort of a in-feed work surface. I'm really surprised more people don't use LVL for workbench tops. I think they're fantastic. I think much better than using 2x4s. They're dry, they're stable, they won't check, they won't warp or twist. LVL is also probably slightly harder than traditional construction lumber due to all the glue lines. It also doesn't really cost any more than traditional construction lumber, and you can pretty much get them at any of the big box stores or other construction yards. Now that all the parts are sized, I'm just doing the layout for the mortises. And the hollow chisel mortiser makes quick work of this. These are through mortises, but they're not going to show, so I'm not too concerned about any tear out or any inaccuracies. I wanted them to be through mortises so that I could wedge the mortises for a little bit of extra strength. And I had to make 2 passes to get the mortises to the size that I needed. Here's a most welcome distraction, my little shop apprentice. I think I was building this on Saturday morning and my wife said, hey, we should go for a walk and get a coffee. So how am I supposed to say no to that? Back to work after the coffee/walk. And because I was a little lazy and didn't sharpen my hollow chisel mortiser bit, I was left with quite a bit of cleanup work. That and just a bad tool setup in general, doesn't give the best results. You can see inside the mortises there's some ridges and stuff. I didn't have the bit squared up properly. So here's how I like to cut tenons. I believe the method's called the speed tenon. Don't make too much fun of the gloves. I just use those for a little bit of extra grip as I'm pushing the piece past the blade. This is a pretty good shot of the technique. You can see it makes quite a bit of dust, but it sure makes accurate tenons fast. Tiny bit of cleanup work with the shoulder plane. Here's the second of 2 leg assemblies going together for the first time. What's that I'm feeling? Must be the sense of achievement. Moving on to the joinery for the stretchers. So I decided to switch over to the multi-router for these mortises since it cuts so much cleaner on the entry and the exit. And we're just using a 3/4 inch diameter, 2-inch long, 2 fluted straight bit, nothing special. But you can see it cuts really clean. And the downside of using a router to cut mortises is you have to go back and square them up. Well, I guess you don't have to, but if you want them square, you got to square them up. Then I jumped over to the bandsaw where I cut a couple of kerfs, which will eventually be a very nice snug home for some wedges. All the experts tell you to drill some holes at the bottom of your kerfs to prevent splitting when you're driving the wedges home. Quick belt change on the wide belt, I think to 150 grit, and that'll help make quick work of sanding. So I bought this sander off a shop that went out of business, and I'll tell you what, there was quite a bit of learning curve getting it home. Gluing some feet onto the bottom of the leg assemblies just kind of lifts it up off the ground a little bit. I cleaned that up with a combination of a bandsaw and, of course, the venerable number 4 hand plane. Then I dumbed down the hand plane surface to 150 grit so it matched everything else on the edge sander here. At some point in time, I'm going to put some dust collection on this thing. Speaking of dust collection, until this cut, I didn't realize that the hose to my chop saw was plugged up. So, looking good, Meyer. Looking real good. Now it's time to glue the 2 leg assemblies up. I don't know why I always get so nervous before a glue up. It just feels so permanent. It must be my fear of commitment. I really have no reason to be nervous. I rarely ever have an issue gluing things together. And in the end, they glued up perfectly and everything was nice and square. Adding in the wedges before the glue is dry. A total of 16 wedges went into the 2 leg assemblies. While the leg assemblies were drying, I moved on to milling up the stretchers, cut them to length, and then I worked on the tenons. I'm real fortunate to have a sliding table saw. It makes working on real long parts like this very, very easy and extremely accurate. So you might be wondering why in this shot I look so tan. In reality, that's not a tan, that's a sunburn. Family and I the previous day drove to the top of Mount Evans, which is at like 14,000 something feet, and boy, I got cooked. And I was unable to use the speed tenon method because the stretchers were like 65 inches long, and I just couldn't slide those back and forth carefully enough. So instead I used the time-honored method of 8,000 cuts and then clean it up with a chisel. I think this is a really great shot of the white ash I was using. It really is a beautiful wood. For whatever reason right now I really like this lumber. Perfectly riffs on for these stretchers too. Maybe I love it so much because it's cheap. Right now at my supplier it's cheaper than red oak. I was sawing really fast here in this shot. I was in a hurry to get these tenons cut down flush. Threw a tiny little chamfer on most of the parts before glue up, just to kind of make it a little easier to touch. Quick visit to the sanding station. When the air conditioner is running in my house, I can't turn on my wide belt sander, so I just decided to go old school. I think right here with my phone, I just turned on Shop Talk Live. Here's a highly prized trade secret. This is how I make my wedges. Oh, here's another trade secret. 2 for Tuesday. I do this to all my acid brushes before I glue up. I think it gives a little bit better control. Glue up time again. This is where the project really comes to life. I like to lay everything out ahead of time as best as possible, and I always keep a non-marring mallet nearby. I find that one of the most useful glue-up tools. I don't like to use too much glue. I see so many people just slopping glue on, thinking that's going to make their project stronger. If your joints are mated together properly, you don't need too much glue. And clean up any little bit of squeeze out or leftover glue with old toothbrush and water, a little drinking straw used as a scraper. And as you can tell from the wet glue, I was in a hurry to get this thing done. Cleaned up the edges with a chisel. A little bit more cleanup with the greatest tool of all time, the Lee-Nielsen low-angle adjustable mouth block plane. And no, they're not a sponsor, though they should be. Just one lag bolt in the middle. This allows for a little bit of expansion contraction at the top. So I had an old can of this of a finish called Osmo, and I decided to go ahead and throw a little bit of that on here. This has got to be the most rewarding part of a project for a woodworker. Seeing the grain come to life is always fun. And I don't know if you could tell or not due to the speed at which this video is playing, but I can just barely contain my excitement right now. Amongst the experts, there's been some debate on how best to apply Osmo, but I just prefer the wipe on, wipe off method. All right, for all the marbles, top's going on. This shot here really gives you a good idea of how narrow this bench is, and I would definitely not recommend this for general work if you have the space, although I think it would go against a garage wall really well if you have to park your car inside or something like that. And due to the weight of the base, it's pretty stable. Just for a general workbench, I think something a little wider would be better. But I think for my purposes, this will be perfect. So I put a little Osmo on the top, and here's some finished shots. This is a pretty decent close-up, showing how crisp and clean those mortises turned out with the wedges. And if you liked this build, let me know. I'd appreciate it. And if you didn't like it, let me know that as well. I welcome the feedback. Thank you for watching. See you next time.